Arizona Territory, 1883. The desert stretched endlessly beneath a merciless sun that had been burning this land long before white men drew borders across it. The morning air carried the scent of creosote and dust, and somewhere in the distance a hawk cried out, circling above something dying or already dead. Garrett Ashford rode slowly across the ridge, his horse picking its way through scattered rocks and dried mesquite. He was 46 years old, weathered by sun and regret in equal measure. His hands, calloused from years of ranch work, held the reins loosely. He was not searching for anything in particular. He had learned long ago that searching implied hope, and hope was a luxury he could no longer afford. But then he saw something that made him pull up short. In the shallow ravine below, partially hidden by scrub brush, a figure lay prone in the dirt. At first, Garrett thought it was a fallen horse, too large to be human. But as his eyes adjusted to the harsh light, he realized the truth. It was a woman, a very tall woman. Her body was motionless except for the slight rise and fall of her shoulders. She was breathing. Garrett dismounted quickly, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud that sent a small cloud of dust into the air. He approached carefully, one hand reaching instinctively toward the rifle on his saddle before stopping himself. Whatever this woman was, she was not a threat, at least not to him. As he drew closer, the details emerged like a nightmare materializing in daylight. The woman's ankles were bound tightly to wooden stakes driven deep into the earth. The rope had cut into her angry red marks that spoke of hours, perhaps a full night, of restraint. Her upper body was pulled forward at an unnatural angle, her face pressed into the dirt, her long black hair matted with dust and dried blood. She was Apache. Garrett could tell from her clothing, from the patterns woven into the tattered fabric of her dress, from the silver and turquoise bracelet that still clung to one powerful wrist. But more than that, he could tell from her size. She was easily 6 feet tall, perhaps more, with shoulders broad enough to carry burdens that would break smaller women. Her arms, though bound, showed the kind of muscle that came not from labor alone, but from training, from discipline, from a lifetime of physical strength carefully cultivated. Garrett stopped 3 feet away. He did not speak. He did not move closer. He simply stood there, his shadow falling across her face, and waited. The response was immediate and visceral. The woman's entire body tensed like a coiled spring. Her eyes flew open, wild and dark, not with rage, but with something far more terrible, fear, deep, bone-deep fear that had carved itself into her over time, becoming part of her the way scars become part of skin. Her voice, when it came, was rough and broken, barely more than a whisper. "Don't. It still hurts there." The words were in English, accented but clear. She was not begging. She was simply stating a fact. "Do not touch me." "It still hurts." The implication was clear. Someone had touched her before. Someone had hurt her, and that someone was not far away. Garrett took a step back. He kept his hands visible, his posture non-threatening. He understood in that moment what he was looking at. This was not an accident. This was not the result of some random violence. This was punishment, deliberate, calculated punishment carried out by someone who believed they had the right. "I'm not going to hurt you," Garrett said quietly, "but I can help you get free." The woman's eyes tracked his movements with the wariness of a trapped animal. She said nothing. Garrett reached slowly for the knife on his belt. The woman flinched, her body pulling away as much as the ropes would allow. He stopped immediately, holding the knife where she could see it clearly, the blade catching the sunlight. "This is for the ropes," he said, "not for you." He took another step back, then another, putting distance between them. Then, very deliberately, he crouched down and placed the knife on the ground, halfway between them, close enough for her to reach if she stretched, far enough that he was not imposing. "You free yourself," Garrett said. "I'll just stand here. Make sure nobody else comes." The woman stared at him for a long moment, her chest heaving with breath she was fighting to control. Then slowly, her eyes shifted to the knife. Garrett turned his back and walked away. Not far, just far enough to give her space. He stood facing the horizon, one hand resting on the neck of his horse, listening to the sounds behind him, the scrape of metal against rock, the labored breathing, the soft grunt of pain as she pulled herself forward, her powerful arms dragging her body across the ground toward the knife. He did not turn around. Not when he heard the rope begin to fray, not when he heard the first strand snap, not when he heard her breathing change, becoming faster, more desperate, as she worked to free herself. The sun climbed higher. Sweat dripped down Garrett's back, soaking through his shirt. His horse shifted restlessly, sensing the tension in the air. Still, Garrett did not turn around. It took longer than he expected. The rope was thick, meant to hold a large animal, and whoever had tied her had done so with brutal efficiency. But eventually, finally, he heard the sound he was waiting for. The metallic clink of the knife hitting the ground, the sharp intake of breath, and then silence. Garrett waited another full minute before he allowed himself to glance back. The woman was sitting upright, her back against a boulder, her legs stretched out before her. The ropes lay coiled at her feet like dead snakes. Her wrists were bleeding where she had cut too close in her haste to be free, but she did not seem to notice. Her eyes were fixed on him, still wary, still ready to fight or flee. But there was something else there now. Something that had not been there before. Recognition, not of him, but of what he had done, or rather, what he had not done. Garrett reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a canteen of water and a strip of clean cloth. He held them up so she could see, then placed them on the ground and stepped back again. "For the cuts," he said simply. The woman did not move immediately. She watched him, studied him, as if trying to understand what kind of trap this might be. When he made no further move, she finally reached forward and took the canteen. She uncapped it with shaking hands and drank deeply, water spilling down her chin and neck. When she was done, she wrapped the cloth clumsily around one wrist, then the other. Only then did Garrett approach again, moving slowly, keeping his movements predictable. He stopped a few feet away and crouched down so that he was at her eye level rather than looming over her. "My name is Garrett Ashford," he said. "I have a ranch about 5 miles west of here. If you need a place to rest, to heal, you can come with me. No strings, no expectations. Just a roof and food until you're strong enough to decide what comes next." The woman stared at him for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice still rough but steadier now. "Why would you help me?" It was a good question. Garrett considered it carefully before answering. "Because a long time ago, I didn't help someone who needed it," he said quietly. "And she died because of that. I can't fix what happened to her, but maybe I can make sure it doesn't happen to someone else." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, searching his face for deception. Whatever she saw there, it seemed to satisfy her, at least partially. "Natane," she said finally. "My name is Natan." Garrett nodded. "Can you stand, Natan?" She tested her weight carefully, her powerful legs pushing her upright. She swayed slightly, her hand shooting out to steady herself against the boulder, but she did not fall. When she straightened to her full height, she stood nearly eye to eye with Garrett, perhaps even slightly taller. He could see the fading bruises on her arms, the old scars layered beneath new wounds. This woman had been hurt before, many times before. "My horse can carry both of us," Garrett said. "It's not far." Natan hesitated, her gaze shifting past him toward the open desert. She was calculating, he realized, measuring distances, considering options, weighing the risk of trusting this strange white man against the risk of staying here, vulnerable and exposed. "They will come looking for me," she said finally. "When they find me gone, they will search." "Who?" Natan's jaw tightened. "My husband, his brother. The men who believe a woman has no right to refuse." The words landed like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of understanding through Garrett. This was not just about one man's cruelty. This was about a system, a structure that held women in place through force, and called it tradition. Then we should move quickly, Garrett said. He helped Natane onto his horse, offering his arm for support but letting her set the pace, letting her decide how much contact she could tolerate. Her grip was strong, stronger than his own, her fingers wrapping completely around his forearm. When she was seated, he swung up behind her, careful to keep distance between their bodies, to give her space even in the confined quarters of the saddle. They rode in silence across the desert, the sun beating down on them like a hammer on an anvil. Garrett kept his eyes on the horizon, watching for dust clouds that might signal pursuit. Behind him, he could feel the tension in Natane's body, the way she held herself rigid, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. It was only when his small ranch house came into view, tucked behind a low ridge of red rock, that she seemed to relax slightly. The building was modest, weathered by years of wind and sun, but solid. Smoke rose from the chimney, a thin line against the pale blue sky. The corrals were well maintained, the fences straight and strong. It was, Garrett knew, not much, but it was honest. And right now, honesty was all he had to offer. He helped Natane down from the horse and led her inside. The interior was sparse but clean. A single room served as both living space and kitchen, with a small bedroom partitioned off by a faded curtain. The furniture was simple, handmade, functional. But there was one detail that stood out, incongruous in the masculine simplicity of the space. Hanging on the wall, carefully preserved behind glass, was a woman's wedding dress. White lace, yellowed slightly with age, the fabric still beautiful despite the years. There was no photograph beside it, no portrait, just the dress, hanging alone like a ghost. Natane's eyes fixed on it immediately. She said nothing, but Garrett saw the question in her gaze. "My wife's," he said quietly. "Lillian. She died 5 years ago." "I'm sorry," Natane said, the words automatic but not insincere. "So am I," Garrett replied. Then, before she could ask more, he gestured toward the bedroom. "You can rest there. I'll sleep out here. There's a bolt on the inside of the door. Use it if it makes you feel safer." Natane nodded slowly. She moved toward the bedroom, then paused at the threshold. "Your wife," she said without turning around. "Did she die peacefully?" The question hung in the air between them, sharp and knowing. Garrett understood what she was really asking. "Did your wife die in her sleep, of old age or illness? Or did she die the way women like us die, violently and too young, at the hands of men who claim to love us?" "No," Garrett said honestly. "She did not die peacefully." Natane nodded again, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. Then she stepped into the bedroom and closed the door. A moment later, Garrett heard the quiet slide of the bolt being drawn. He stood alone in the main room, staring at the wedding dress on the wall. Lillian had worn it only once, on the day they married. She had been so happy then, so full of hope for the future they would build together. She could not have known that future would be so short, so brutal in its ending. Garrett turned away and walked outside. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and gold. It was beautiful, the way dying things often are. He had not been entirely truthful with Natane. It was not just that Lillian had died violently. It was that she had died because Garrett had been too afraid to act, too paralyzed by fear and doubt to do what needed to be done. And that failure had haunted him every day since. But perhaps, he thought, looking back toward the house where a tall Apache woman was finally resting behind a bolted door, perhaps this was his chance to do it right. Not to save Lillian, who was beyond saving, but to save someone else, to prove to himself that he had learned something from his failure, that he could be the man he should have been 5 years ago. The first day passed in tense silence. Natane emerged from the bedroom only twice, once to drink water and once to use the outhouse. Each time, Garrett made himself scarce, understanding that she needed space to process what had happened, to begin the slow work of feeling safe again. On the second day, she stayed out longer. She sat on the front step in the early morning, Her face turned toward the sun, her eyes closed. Garrett watched from the barn as she simply breathed, as if relearning how to exist without fear pressing down on her chest. It was on the third day, as the sun softened toward evening, that she finally spoke more than a few words. Garrett was preparing a simple meal, beans and cornbread, nothing special. Natan sat at the rough wooden table, her large hands resting flat on the surface, her eyes distant. "The man who tied me," she said suddenly. "He was not a stranger. He was not an enemy." Garrett stopped what he was doing, but did not turn around. He sensed that she needed to say this without his eyes on her, without the pressure of being watched. "He was my husband," Natan continued. "Caden, a warrior respected in our community, a man who speaks of honor and tradition and the proper way for women to behave." Her voice was steady, but Garrett could hear the current of anger beneath it, running deep and cold. "He says I am too tall, too strong, that I make him look weak in front of other men. He says a good wife should know how to be small, how to make herself less so, that her husband can be more." Natan's fingers curled slowly into fists on the table. "For 10 years, I have tried to be small. I have walked behind him. I have spoken softly. I have bowed my head. But it is never enough. Because the problem is not how I act. The problem is what I am. And I cannot change that." Garrett turned then, leaning against the counter, his arms crossed over his chest. "The ropes," he said quietly. "That wasn't the first time, was it?" Natan's eyes met his, and he saw the answer there before she spoke. "No," she said. "It was the third time. Each time the ropes stay longer. Each time he leaves me farther from help. This time, if you had not found me, I would have died there." "Why?" Garrett asked. "What did you do to make him so angry?" Natane laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I asked if our son could learn to read English. That was my crime. I suggested that Ashki should know the language of the white men who now control this land, so that he would not be helpless when they came with their papers and their laws." She shook her head slowly. "Caden said I was trying to turn our son against his own people. He said I was poisoning Ashki's mind with ideas of the white world, and so he decided to teach me a lesson about respect and tradition." Garrett felt anger rising in his chest, hot and bitter. He knew this kind of man. He had grown up with one. His own brother Josiah had that same twisted logic, that same ability to convince himself that violence was justified as long as it was wrapped in righteous words. "Where is your son now?" Garrett asked. Natan's expression shifted, pain replacing anger. "With Caden, with the tribe. I have not seen him since I ran." "How old is he?" 10 years, old enough to understand that his mother is gone, but too young to understand why." Garrett pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "You ran to protect him," he said. It was not a question. "I ran because I realized something," Natan said. "I realized that if I stayed, if I let Caden keep breaking me down piece by piece, then Ashki would grow up thinking that is how men treat women. He would learn that love means control, that strength means domination, and I could not let him become that kind of man." She looked down at her scarred hands. "So I chose. I chose to leave my son so that someday when he is older, I can tell him that his mother loved him enough to leave, that she loved him enough to show him there is another way." Garrett sat in silence, processing this. He understood now why Natan had accepted his help. It was not because she trusted him. It was because she had already made the hardest choice a mother could make, and after that, trusting a stranger was easy by comparison. "There's something you should know," Garrett said slowly, "about why I understand what you're going through." He stood and walked to the wedding dress on the wall. He touched the glass gently, his fingers leaving no mark. "Lillian was my wife," he began. "We married young, full of dreams about building a life together. And for the first few years, it was good. We worked this land together side by side. We talked about children, about the future." He paused, gathering the words that were always hard to speak. "My brother Josiah, he was the local sheriff, still is. a respected man, or so everyone thought. But Lillian, she saw the truth. She saw the way he treated people when he thought no one was watching. She saw the cruelty hidden beneath his badge. Garrett's hand dropped to his side. Josiah took a liking to Lillian, not in a way a brother should. He would come by when he knew I was working far from the house. He would talk to her, stand too close, touch her arm in ways that made her uncomfortable. When she told me, I didn't believe her at first. Josiah was my brother. He was a lawman. Surely he wouldn't do such things. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. But Lillian kept insisting. She begged me to talk to him, to make him stop, and I did talk to him, once. Josiah laughed it off, said Lillian was imagining things, that she was lonely out here and maybe a little unstable. And God help me, part of me believed him. Part of me wanted to believe him because the alternative was too terrible. Garrett's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Then one night, Lillian said she was leaving. She said she couldn't stay here anymore, couldn't live in fear. She packed a bag and walked out that door. Josiah was waiting for her on the road. I don't know if he followed her or if he was just passing by. But they argued. And then I heard the gunshot. He closed his eyes against the memory. By the time I got there, she was already dead. Josiah had his gun in his hand, and he was calm as still water. He told me she had attacked him, tried to steal his gun. He said he had no choice but to defend himself. And because he was the sheriff, because he was my brother, his word was law. Garrett opened his eyes and looked at Natane. Nobody believed Lillian when she was alive, and nobody believed her when she was dead. Josiah is still sheriff. He still walks free. And I have spent 5 years living with the knowledge that I could have saved her if I had just been brave enough to believe her, to stand with her against my own blood. Natane listened in silence. When Garrett finished, she nodded slowly. So that is why you helped me, she said. Not out of kindness, out of guilt. Maybe, Garrett admitted. But does it matter? The help is real either way. Yes, Natane said. It matters, because guilt is a heavy stone to carry, and you cannot make up for one woman's death by saving another. I know, Garrett said, but I can try. They sat in silence as the light outside faded to purple and then to black. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. Somewhere outside a coyote howled, lonely and distant. Finally, Natane spoke again. There is something else you should know, she said, about why Caden wants me back so badly, about why he will not just let me go. Garrett waited. 3 days from now, Natane said. Caden is supposed to sign papers with the American government, papers that will give him ownership of land, but he cannot sign these papers without proof that he has custody of our son. And he cannot have custody if I am still alive and claiming Ashkey. She met Garrett's eyes across the table. So you see, this is not just about honor or tradition, or a husband's wounded pride. This is about money, about power, about land that will be worth thousands of dollars once the silver mines move into this territory. Garrett felt a chill run down his spine. He's using your son as a claim to land. Yes, and if I am dead or if I am declared unfit, then Caden gets everything. The land, the money, the respect of being a man who can make deals with the white government. And if you're alive and demanding custody, then he loses it all, Natane said simply, which is why he will come for me, not to bring me home, to make sure I never speak again. As if summoned by her words, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the desert. Multiple horses moving fast. Garrett stood quickly and moved to the window. In the moonlight he could see 3 riders approaching, their silhouettes dark against the silver sand. They stopped at the edge of his property line, just close enough to be seen, but not close enough to be trespassing. One of the riders called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "Garrett Ashford, we know you have something that does not belong to you." Garrett recognized the voice immediately. His blood turned to ice in his veins. It was Josiah. His brother had found them. And standing beside Josiah in the moonlight were 2 Apache men, one of whom Garrett guessed must be Caden himself. Natane appeared at Garrett's shoulder, looking out the window. When she saw the riders, her entire body tensed. "It is him," she whispered. "Caden." Garrett looked at the woman beside him. In the dim light, he could see the fear in her eyes, but beneath it was something harder, something that had not been broken despite everything she had endured. "You don't have to face them," Garrett said. "You can hide. I'll tell them I haven't seen you." Natan shook her head slowly. "I am tired of hiding. They'll take you back. Not if I refuse to go." "Natan, that's not how this works. They have the law on their side. Josiah is the sheriff, and Caden is your husband. By law, you belong to him." Natan turned to face Garrett fully. In the firelight, her face was set with determination, her jaw clenched, her eyes hard as stone. "Then the law is wrong," she said simply, "and I will not obey it." Before Garrett could respond, the front door burst open, but it was not the three riders outside. It was a fourth person, someone who had approached from the back while they were distracted by the others. A woman stood in the doorway, breathing hard, her dress torn and dirty, her blonde hair falling loose around her shoulders. Her face was bruised, one eye swollen nearly shut, fresh blood trickling from her split lip. "Garrett," she gasped, "please, you have to help me." Garrett stared in shock at the woman he had not seen in 5 years, the woman he had thought of just days ago. "Clara?" he whispered. It was his brother's wife, and from the look of her, Josiah had finally crossed a line that even the law could not ignore. Clara stumbled forward, nearly collapsing. Natane caught her before she fell, her strong arms steadying the smaller woman. "He's going to kill me," Clara sobbed. "Tonight." "I heard him planning it. He's going to make it look like an accident, like I fell, like I hurt myself, just like he did with Lillian. Please, Garrett, I know I should have spoken up before. I know I should have told the truth about what he did to your wife. But I was afraid. I'm still afraid, but I can't go back there. If I go back, I'm dead." Outside, Josiah's voice called again, angrier now. "Garrett, send out the Apache woman, and send out my wife. She's hysterical, not thinking clearly. She needs to come home where she belongs." Garrett looked from Clara to Natane. 2 women, 2 different stories, but both running from the same thing. Men who believed they owned them, men who would kill rather than let them go free. And standing between these women and those men was Garrett. Just one man with one ranch and no legal power, a man who had failed once before, a man who knew with absolute certainty that if he failed again, people would die. The choice should have been impossible. The smart thing would be to surrender both women, to let the law handle it, to protect himself and his property. That was what any reasonable man would do. But Garrett had spent 5 years living with the consequences of being reasonable. 5 years remembering the sound of a gunshot and the sight of his wife's blood soaking into the desert sand. He walked to the door and opened it wide. He stepped out onto the porch, his hands empty and visible. Josiah sat his horse with casual arrogance, his sheriff's badge gleaming in the moonlight. Beside him, Caden watched with cold eyes, his face expressionless. The third rider, a younger Apache man, looked uncertain, his gaze darting between Caden and Garrett. "Brother," Josiah said with false warmth, "you're harboring fugitives. That's a serious crime." "They're not fugitives," Garrett said calmly. "They're guests. The Apache woman is a runaway wife. By law, she belongs to her husband. And Clara, well, Clara has had one of her episodes. She gets confused sometimes, doesn't she, Caden?" Caden nodded slowly. "My wife also has episodes. Women, they are emotional creatures. They need strong men to guide them, to protect them from their own instability." Garrett felt rage building in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "Funny how these episodes always seem to result in bruises." Josiah's smile faded. "Are you questioning my authority, Garrett?" "I'm questioning your humanity." The words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Josiah's hand moved toward his gun, then stopped. Even he understood that shooting an unarmed man in front of witnesses would be hard to explain. "This can be easy or hard," Josiah said coldly, "but either way, those women are coming with us. You can cooperate, or I can arrest you for obstruction. Your choice." Behind Garrett, the door opened again. Natan stepped out, Clara leaning on her arm. In the moonlight they made a strange pair, the tall Apache warrior and the battered white woman. But there was something powerful in their united stance, something that made even Josiah pause. "We are not going," Natane said clearly. "You have no right to force us." Caden spurred his horse forward slightly. "Wife, you are making a fool of yourself. Come home. We will forget this happened." "No," Natan said simply. "I will not forget. And I will not come home. Not now. Not ever." "Then you will lose your son," Caden said, his voice hardening. "I have already begun the papers. By law, a mother who abandons her child has no claim. Ashki will be mine, and you will never see him again." Natan's face went white, but her voice remained steady. "If that is the price of freedom, then I will pay it. I would rather lose my son to distance than have him grow up watching his father abuse his mother. At least this way he has a chance to become a better man than you." The younger Apache man, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke, his voice urgent in Apache. Caden snapped something back, but the younger man shook his head and spoke again, louder this time. "What's he saying?" Garrett asked quietly. Natan listened, then translated. "He is Dayami, Caden's brother. He says this is wrong. He says Caden shames the tribe with these actions. He says a true warrior does not use children as weapons." Caden wheeled his horse toward his brother, his face twisted with fury. An argument erupted in rapid Apache, voices rising and falling. Josiah watched with growing impatience, his hand now resting openly on his gun. "Enough," Josiah said finally. "I don't care about your tribal disputes. By the authority vested in me as sheriff of this territory, I am ordering these women to come with us." Garrett, step aside. Garrett did not move. "Last warning, brother." "Then arrest me," Garrett said. "Do it in front of witnesses. Arrest me for the crime of protecting 2 women from men who want to kill them. Let's see how that looks when it goes before a judge." Josiah's eyes narrowed. "You have no proof of anything." "Clara has proof," Garrett said. "She saw you shoot Lillian. She's been too afraid to speak until now. But fear has a way of losing its hold when death is the alternative." The words landed like a physical blow. Josiah's face went white, then red. "She's lying. She's hysterical." "Maybe," Garrett said. "Or maybe there's a federal marshal who'd be very interested in hearing her testimony. Funny thing about federal marshals, they outrank local sheriffs, and they tend to take a dim view of lawmen who murder innocent women." It was a bluff. Garrett had no connection to any federal marshal, but the threat was real enough to make Josiah hesitate. "This isn't over," Josiah said finally. He pulled his horse around sharply, not by a long shot. Caden followed, but Dayami remained for a moment longer. He looked at Natan, his expression complex, mixing shame and admiration, and something that might have been hope. "Be strong, sister," he said in English. Then he too turned and rode away into the darkness. Garrett, Natan, and Clara stood on the porch, watching until the last sound of hoofbeats faded into silence. "They'll be back," Clara said softly. "I know," Garrett replied. What do we do?" Garrett looked at the 2 women beside him, both battered, both afraid, but neither broken. Not yet. Not quite. "We find someone who outranks a crooked sheriff," Garrett said. "We find a federal marshal, and we make sure that this time, when the truth is told, someone actually listens." Natan nodded slowly. "And if no one listens?" Garrett thought of Lillian's wedding dress hanging on his wall. He thought of 5 years of regret and failure. He thought of the choice he had made tonight, the line he had crossed by choosing to stand rather than surrender. "Then we make them listen," he said. Inside the house, by lamplight, they made plans. But outside in the darkness, unseen by any of them, another figure watched. A man neither Apache nor white, but something in between, a man who had been sent to observe, to report back, to ensure that certain interests were protected. This man watched the house with cold eyes. Then he turned his horse south, toward the territorial capital, where men in fine suits made decisions that affected people like Natan and Clara without ever having to look them in the eye. The game was bigger than any of them knew, and the stakes were higher than one woman's freedom or another woman's life. The stakes were the future of the entire territory, and blood, as always, would be the price of progress. Dawn broke over the Arizona desert like a wound opening in the sky, blood red and raw. Garrett had not slept. He sat on the porch steps, his rifle across his knees, watching the horizon for dust clouds that would signal approaching riders. Behind him, through the thin walls of the ranch house, he could hear the soft murmur of women's voices. Natani and Clara, two strangers bound together by violence and fear, finding in each other something they had not expected: understanding. The night had been long and filled with planning. Clara had told them everything she knew about Josiah's schedule, his routines, his contacts. She had lived in terror for 3 years, cataloging her husband's movements the way a prisoner marks days on a cell wall, always searching for the moment when escape might be possible. That moment had finally come, not through planning, but through desperation. Josiah had struck her harder than usual, and something inside Clara had simply broken. Not her spirit, but her capacity for endurance. There is a limit to how much fear one person can carry, and she had reached hers. Natan had listened to Clara's story with the stillness of someone who understood every word without needing explanation. She had shared her own story in return, and in the telling, something had shifted between them. They were no longer just two women running. They were allies, but allies, Garrett knew, would not be enough. What they needed was the law. Real law, not the twisted version that Josiah represented. They needed someone with authority that could not be questioned, could not be bought, could not be intimidated. They needed a federal marshal. The problem was finding one, and doing so before Josiah returned with more men and a legal warrant that would make resistance impossible. Garrett stood as the sun climbed higher, his joints stiff from a night of sitting. He walked inside to find Natane and Clara at the table, a crude map drawn on a piece of brown paper between them. Natan's finger traced a route south. "There," she said. "The Apache Council meets in 3 days at the winter camp. If I can speak before them, if I can tell them what Caden is doing, they may intervene. The elders still have authority over matters of marriage and family." "Will they listen to you?" Garrett asked. Natane's expression was uncertain. "I do not know. Some of the elders are traditional. They believe a wife should submit to her husband. But others are pragmatic. They understand that the old ways are changing, that we must adapt or be destroyed. If I can convince them that Caden is using tribal law to serve his own greed rather than the good of the people, they may side with me." Clara looked up at Garrett. "And what about us? What about Josiah?" "There's a federal marshal stationed in Copper Ridge," Garrett said. "Owen Finch. He's the only lawman in the territory who ever questioned Josiah's version of what happened to Lillian. He couldn't prove anything, but he suspected. If we can get to him, if we can convince him to investigate Clara's testimony, we might have a chance." "Copper Ridge is 2 days' ride," Clara said, her voice tight. "Josiah will be there. It's his town." "I know," Garrett said. "Which is why we need to be smart about this. We can't just walk in and hope for the best." Natan folded the map carefully. "Then we divide our efforts. I will go to the council. You will go to this marshal. We each fight our own battle, but for the same war." "That's a lot of ground to cover in 3 days," Garrett said. "Then we should stop talking and start moving," Natane replied. She was right. Every hour they delayed gave Josiah and Caden more time to plan, to gather support, to build their case. Speed was their only advantage now. They prepared quickly. Garrett saddled 2 horses, his own, and an older mare that had seen better days but could still cover distance. He packed supplies for travel, dried meat and hardtack, canteens filled from the well. Clara gathered what few possessions she had brought with her, a small bundle that spoke to the hasty nature of her escape. Natan needed nothing. She stood in the yard, her face turned toward the mountains where her people lived, her expression unreadable. Garrett wondered what she was thinking. Was she afraid, determined, or simply resigned to whatever would come? As if sensing his gaze, Natane turned to face him. "You asked me once if I was afraid," she said. "I never answered you." "You don't have to," Garrett said. "But I want to," Natane replied. "Yes, I am afraid. I am afraid I will never see my son again. I am afraid the council will not believe me. I am afraid that Caden will find a way to take everything from me. But I am more afraid of what will happen if I do nothing." Fear is not the absence of action. It is the presence of stakes. And my stakes are too high to let fear stop me. She mounted the older mare with the fluid grace of someone who had been riding since childhood. Clara climbed up behind Garrett, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist. She was shaking, Garrett realized, not from cold but from the enormity of what she was about to do. Going back to Copper Ridge meant confronting Josiah, meant making her accusation public, meant risking everything on the hope that someone would finally believe her. They rode out together, the three of them, as the sun climbed toward its zenith. At the fork in the trail, where the path split between south toward the Apache winter camp and east toward Copper Ridge, they stopped. 3 days, Garrett said. We meet back here no matter what happens. If either of us fails, we need to know so we can plan the next move. Natane nodded. She looked at Clara, and something passed between them, a wordless communication that transcended culture and language. Then she turned her horse south and rode away, her tall figure growing smaller against the vast expanse of desert until she was just a dark speck on the horizon, and then nothing at all. Garrett and Clara continued east. The land changed as they rode, becoming rockier, more treacherous. The sun beat down without mercy, turning the air into something thick and suffocating. They stopped twice to water the horse and rest in what little shade they could find, but otherwise they pushed forward, eating distance. It was late afternoon when they saw the town. Copper Ridge sprawled in a shallow valley, a collection of wooden buildings that looked temporary even after years of settlement. The main street was wide and dusty, lined with businesses that served the miners and ranchers who worked the surrounding territory. The sheriff's office sat prominently near the center of town, a constant reminder of who held power here. "We can't go through the main street," Clara said quietly. "Too many people know me. If anyone sees me and tells Josiah, we'll never make it to the marshal." "Where does Finch stay?" Garrett asked. "He has a room above the general store, but he takes his meals at the boarding house on the north edge of town." Garrett considered this. "It's almost dinner time. If we're lucky, he'll be there now. We approach from the back, avoid the main street entirely." They circled wide around the town, using the terrain to stay hidden. The boarding house was a 2-story structure that had once been painted white, but had faded to a tired gray. A woman stood on the back porch, beating dust from a rug with methodical violence. She looked up sharply as Garrett and Clara approached. "Help you?" she asked, her tone making it clear that help was not actually what she expected to provide. "We're looking for Marshal Finch," Garrett said. "Is he here?" The woman's eyes narrowed, taking in Clara's bruised face, the desperate look in her eyes. Her expression softened slightly. "He's inside, taking his dinner. You in some kind of trouble?" "Yes," Clara said simply. The woman set down her carpet beater and jerked her head toward the back door. "Go on in. Don't make a scene. I run a respectable establishment." The interior of the boarding house was dim and smelled of boiled meat and old wood. A handful of men sat at long tables, eating in silence or talking in low voices. At the far end of the room, alone at a small table near the window, sat Marshal Owen Finch. He was in his mid-50s, Garrett guessed, with the kind of weathered face that came from decades of outdoor work. His hair was mostly gray, cut short and practical. He wore no uniform, just simple clothing that would not mark him as law enforcement to a casual observer. But there was something in his bearing, in the way his eyes constantly scanned the room, that spoke of authority held quietly but firmly. Garrett approached slowly, Clara a half step behind him. Finch looked up as they drew near, his gaze moving from Garrett to Clara. Whatever he saw in their faces made him set down his fork and gesture to the empty chairs at his table. "You're Garrett Ashford," Finch said. It was not a question. "Josiah's brother." "Yes," Garrett said, sitting down. Clara remained standing, as if afraid that sitting would trap her, make escape impossible. "And you're Clara Ashford?" Finch continued, his eyes lingering on her bruised face. "Josiah's wife. I heard you'd run off. There's talk that you've taken ill, gone to stay with relatives back east." "That's a lie," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Finch nodded slowly. "Most of what Josiah says is a lie. The question is whether anyone's willing to call him on it." He looked at Garrett. "I'm guessing that's why you're here, to call him on it." 5 years ago, Garrett said, "my wife Lillian was shot and killed by Josiah. He claimed self-defense, but it was murder. Clara witnessed it." Finch's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes. Interest, or perhaps vindication. "That's a serious accusation." "It's the truth," Clara said. She pulled out a chair and sat down abruptly, as if her legs would no longer support her. "I saw everything. Lillian was running away. She had a bag with her clothes. She was leaving. Josiah followed her. They argued. She never touched his gun. She never threatened him. He just shot her. And then he told me that if I ever said anything, he would kill my father. My father lives in a nursing home that Josiah pays for. Without that money, he would have nowhere to go." "Why tell me now?" Finch asked. "What's changed?" Clara's hand moved to her swollen eye, touching it gingerly. "He's escalating. The violence is getting worse. Last night he told me I was becoming a liability. He said accidents happen to women who talk too much. I knew if I stayed, I would be dead within a week, maybe less. And I decided that living in fear is the same as being dead anyway. At least this way, I have a chance." Finch leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I've suspected Josiah of being dirty for years, but suspicion isn't evidence. And he's careful, very careful. The problem is, even with your testimony, it's going to be hard to make this stick. You're his wife. A good lawyer will argue you have reason to lie, that you're trying to escape the marriage, and you're willing to say anything to make that happen." "I know," Clara said. "But I have to try. Even if it doesn't work, even if he walks away free, at least I'll have told the truth. At least Lillian's story will have been heard." Garrett spoke up. "There's more. Josiah is working with an Apache man named Caden. Caden is trying to force his wife to return so he can use their son to claim land rights. Josiah is helping him, probably in exchange for a cut of the profits once the land is sold." Finch's eyebrows rose slightly. "Land fraud. That's federal jurisdiction. If I can prove Josiah is involved in that, I can bring him in for investigation regardless of what happened with your wife." "The Apache woman, Natan, she's gone to her tribal council to make her case," Garrett explained. "If the council sides with her, they can revoke Caden's claim to the child. Without the child, there's no land claim. Without the land claim, there's no money. And without money, Caden has no reason to pay Josiah." "It's a house of cards," Finch said. "Pull out one card and the whole thing collapses." "Exactly," Garrett said. "But we need you to be ready to move when it does. We need you to be there to arrest Josiah before he can run or cover his tracks." Finch was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the table. Finally, he nodded. "I'll do it. But you need to understand the risk. If this goes wrong, if we can't make the charges stick, Josiah will come after all of you. And, as sheriff, he'll have the law on his side. I can protect you to a degree, but only if we do this by the book." "We understand," Garrett said. "Do you?" Finch's gaze was piercing. "Because in my experience, people who've never faced down the full weight of corrupt authority don't really understand what they're up against. Josiah has spent years building his power base. He has friends, allies, people who owe him favors. Taking him down won't be as simple as presenting evidence and expecting justice to prevail." "Then what do we do?" Clara asked. "We make it public," Finch said. "We bring the accusation in front of as many witnesses as possible. Make it impossible for him to sweep under the rug. The territorial governor is scheduled to visit Copper Ridge in 2 days for a ceremony dedicating the new courthouse. If we can confront Josiah then, with the governor and half the town watching, he won't be able to simply disappear the problem. Garrett felt a chill run down his spine. That's cutting it very close. Natan won't be back from the Apache Council by then. Then she'll have to hurry, Finch said bluntly. Because this window won't stay open long. Josiah already knows Clara is with you. He's probably already working on a plan to discredit her or silence her permanently. Every hour we wait gives him more time to prepare. Clara reached across the table and gripped Garrett's hand. We do it, she said. 2 days, at the ceremony. Even if Natan isn't there, we do it. Garrett looked at her bruised face, at the determination in her eyes that no amount of violence had been able to extinguish. He thought of Lillian, of how she had died alone and afraid on a dark road. He thought of Natan, riding south toward an uncertain welcome and a council that might very well side with her husband over her. 2 days, he agreed. Finch stood. There's a abandoned line shack about 3 miles north of here. No one uses it anymore. You two should hole up there until the ceremony. I'll make sure you're not disturbed. And I'll start making arrangements to have federal witnesses present at the dedication. The more official eyes on this, the better. Thank you, Clara said softly. Finch shook his head. Don't thank me yet. We haven't won anything. We've just started a fight that's going to get bloody before it's over. He was right, Garrett knew, but there was no turning back now. The die was cast. In 2 days, everything would come to a head. Either they would succeed in bringing Josiah down, or they would fail and lose everything. They left the boarding house the same way they had come, through the back door and into the gathering dusk. The line shack Finch had mentioned was easy to find, a small structure built into the side of a hill, half collapsed, but still weatherproof enough to provide shelter. They settled in as night fell, neither of them speaking much, both lost in their own thoughts. It was Clara who finally broke the silence. Do you think she'll make it back in time, Natan? I don't know, Garrett admitted. The Apache Council moves at its own pace. They don't operate on white man's schedules. Will they help her? I hope so, but hope isn't much to build a plan on. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Can I ask you something? Of course. Why didn't you speak up 5 years ago, when Lillian died? Why didn't you accuse Josiah then? It was the question Garrett had been asking himself for 5 years, the question that haunted his dreams and poisoned his waking hours. Because I was afraid, he said simply. Afraid of my brother, afraid of what it would mean to accuse him, afraid that no one would believe me, afraid of being alone. I told myself I was being practical, that there was no evidence, that it was my word against his. But the truth is, I was just a coward. And Lillian paid the price for my cowardice. You're not a coward now, Clara said. No, Garrett agreed. But that doesn't undo the past. It doesn't bring her back. The best I can do is make sure her death meant something. Make sure that this time, when someone needs help, I don't turn away. They slept in shifts, one keeping watch while the other rested. The night passed slowly, marked by the distant howl of coyotes and the rustle of wind through dry grass. When dawn came, it brought with it a visitor. Garrett woke to the sound of a horse approaching. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the door, Clara right behind him. The rider was alone, moving slowly, hands raised to show he was unarmed. As he drew closer, Garrett recognized him. It was Diami, Caden's brother, the young Apache man who had spoken against Caden the night they had come to Garrett's ranch. Diami dismounted and approached on foot. He spoke in accented but clear English. I come with information and a warning. Speak, Garrett said, not lowering his rifle. The council meets tomorrow, not in 3 days, as you believed. Caden has pushed for an early session. He wants to force a decision before Natan can gather support. Garrett felt his stomach drop. Tomorrow? Is Natan there? She arrived this morning. She has until sunset tomorrow to make her case. But Caden has been preparing for weeks. He has gifts for the elders, promises of wealth from the land he will claim. He has positioned himself as a defender of tradition while painting Natan as a woman corrupted by white influence. Will the council listen to her? Clara asked. Diami's expression was troubled. Some will. Others have already decided. The council is divided. It will come down to the testimony of witnesses, and Caden has many witnesses willing to speak on his behalf. What about you? Garrett asked. Will you speak for Natan? I will try, Diami said. But my voice carries little weight. I am younger, less established. Caden is a respected warrior. The elders trust him. Even though he's lying? They do not see it as lying. They see it as a man doing what is necessary to protect his family and his status. In their eyes, Natan is the one who has violated the natural order by refusing her husband's authority. Garrett lowered his rifle slowly. You rode all night to tell us this. Why? Diami met his gaze steadily. Because my brother is destroying what it means to be Apache. We are not a people who abuse women. We are not a people who use children as tools for profit. But if Caden succeeds, if he becomes wealthy and powerful through these means, others will follow his example. And we will become the very thing we once fought against, tyrants who oppress the weak. He paused, then added, My brother was not always this way. Once he was truly honorable, but power has poisoned him, and I cannot stand by and watch him poison my people as well. What do you need from us? Garrett asked. Nothing, Diami said. I came only to warn you, to tell you that time is shorter than you thought. Whatever you plan to do, you must do it quickly. He remounted his horse. Before riding away, he looked back at Garrett and Clara. There is one more thing, he said. Caden knows you are here, in Copper Ridge. He has sent men to watch the town. If you move openly, they will report to him, and he will use your presence to argue that Natan has been corrupted by association with white men, that she cannot be trusted to speak truth. So we're trapped, Clara said. If we act, we make things worse for Natan. If we don't act, Josiah gets away. Yes, Diami said simply. Then he rode away, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness. Garrett and Clara stood in the doorway of the line shack, watching the sun rise. The day of the courthouse dedication, the day they had planned to confront Josiah publicly, was still tomorrow. But Natane's hearing before the Apache Council was today, and they had no way to help her, no way to even reach her in time. We have to trust her, Clara said quietly. We have to trust that she can win this battle on her own. I know, Garrett said, but trust is hard when the stakes are this high. They spent the day in tense waiting, watching the road for any sign of movement, any indication that events were moving faster than expected. Marshal Finch came once, bringing food and news. The governor had arrived early and was staying at the hotel in town. The ceremony was set for noon tomorrow. Everything was in place. But Finch also brought troubling information. Josiah had been asking questions, making inquiries about Garrett's whereabouts. He knew his brother was in the area. He knew Clara was with him. And he was preparing for confrontation. He's afraid, Finch said, which makes him dangerous. A cornered animal fights hardest when it knows it's about to die. As the sun set on that long day, Garrett stood outside the line shack and looked south, toward the Apache lands where Natan was making her stand. He did not pray, had not prayed in years, but he found himself hoping with an intensity that felt almost like prayer, hoping that she would find the words to convince the council, hoping that the elders would see through Caden's lies, hoping that justice, for once, would actually prevail. But hope, as he had told Clara, was not much to build a plan on. The night fell thick and dark, a new moon offering no light. In the distance, Copper Ridge glowed with lantern light, a small island of civilization in an ocean of wilderness. Somewhere in that town, Josiah was preparing his defense, marshaling his allies, readying himself for the fight to come. And somewhere to the south, in a council circle lit by fire, Natan stood before the elders of her people, her tall frame casting long shadows, her voice strong and clear as she told the truth that so many had tried to silence. Two battles, separated by miles, but connected by thread, as thin and strong as spider silk. The outcome of one would determine the fate of the other. And neither Garrett nor Natan knew yet which battle would be won, which would be lost, and what price would be paid in blood and sorrow before the sun rose again. The morning of the courthouse dedication dawned clear and bright, the kind of day that seemed to mock the dark business that would unfold beneath its cheerful sky. Garrett and Clara rose before dawn and made their way carefully into Copper Ridge, staying to the back streets and alleys, avoiding the main thoroughfare where preparations for the ceremony were already underway. Marshal Finch met them behind the general store, his expression grim. "The governor is here. He'll be speaking at noon. I've arranged for you to be positioned near the platform where you can be seen and heard. But Garrett, you need to understand what's going to happen. The moment Clara makes her accusation, Josiah is going to respond, and he's not going to go quietly." "I know," Garrett said, "but we don't have a choice. This is our only shot." "There's always a choice," Finch said. "The question is whether you can live with the consequences of the choice you make." Before Garrett could respond, a commotion erupted from the main street. Voices raised in surprise and excitement, the sound of many horses arriving at once. Finch moved to the corner of the building and looked around. His eyes widened. "Well," he said, "this just got a lot more complicated." Garrett joined him and looked out at the main street. What he saw made his heart leap into his throat. Riding down the center of the street was Natan, but she was not alone. Behind her came at least 20 Apache riders, including Diami and an elderly man who rode with the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The council elders, Garrett realized. They had come to Copper Ridge, and walking beside Natan's horse, his small hand gripping her stirrup, was a boy of about 10 years old, Ashki, her son. The townspeople stopped what they were doing and stared. It was unusual to see so many Apache in town at once, unusual for them to come armed and in numbers. A nervous energy rippled through the crowd, uncertainty mixing with fear. Natan dismounted in front of the sheriff's office. The elderly Apache man dismounted beside her. And then, to Garrett's shock, a third figure stepped forward from the group. It was an older white man, perhaps 70, with white hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore a suit that marked him as someone of importance, and he carried himself with quiet authority. "That's impossible," Finch breathed. "Who is he?" Garrett asked. "That's Judge Samuel Hartford, federal circuit judge. He retired 2 years ago." "What in God's name is he doing here?" The answer became clear as Natan spoke, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "I come to speak truth before witnesses. I request the presence of the territorial governor and all people of authority in this town. I have testimony regarding corruption, land fraud, and murder." The crowd erupted in murmurs. Windows opened as people leaned out to see what was happening. And from the sheriff's office, Josiah emerged, his face carefully composed, but his eyes blazing with barely controlled fury. "This is my jurisdiction," Josiah said loudly. "These people need to leave, now." The elderly Apache man spoke then in accented but clear English. "I am Bidziel, elder of the Apache people. We have come because matters of justice concern us all, white and Apache alike. We will not leave until truth has been spoken and heard." Judge Hartford stepped forward. "And I am here because I received word that there may be federal crimes being committed in this territory. I may be retired, but I still have authority to convene a hearing if necessary. Sheriff Ashford, I suggest you cooperate." Josiah's composure cracked slightly. His hand moved toward his gun, then stopped. Even he understood that threatening a federal judge in front of witnesses would end very badly. "What is this about?" Josiah demanded. Natani looked directly at him. "This is about your alliance with Caden to defraud the government of land. This is about your involvement in the murder of Lillian Ashford. This is about justice that has been delayed, but will no longer be denied." The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama. Garrett saw the territorial governor emerge from the hotel, flanked by his aides, drawn by the commotion. Everything was converging exactly as they had hoped, but faster and with more witnesses than they had dared to imagine. Marshal Finch stepped forward from his position behind the general store. "Governor Whitmore," he called out, "I'm Marshal Owen Finch. I have testimony regarding serious criminal activity by Sheriff Josiah Ashford. I request your permission to conduct a public inquiry." The governor, a portly man in his 50s with shrewd eyes, looked around at the assembled crowd, at the Apache riders, at Judge Hartford. He was a politician, Garrett realized, and politicians understood optics. Whatever happened here today would be witnessed and remembered. The governor could not afford to be seen protecting corruption, not with an election coming. "Permission granted," the governor said. "Let's hear what this is about." Josiah's face went pale, then red. "This is outrageous. These people are trying to destroy my reputation with lies and innuendo." "Then you have nothing to fear from the truth," Judge Hartford said mildly. "Marshal Finch, proceed." What happened next unfolded with the surreal quality of a dream. The ceremony was abandoned, the courthouse dedication forgotten. Instead, the crowd gathered in the town square as an impromptu hearing began, with Judge Hartford presiding from the steps of the new courthouse and the governor watching with keen interest. Clara was the first to testify. She stood before the crowd, her voice shaking but growing stronger as she spoke. She described Lillian's death in detail, described how Josiah had followed her, had shot her without provocation, had then threatened Clara into silence. Josiah attempted to interrupt several times, but Judge Hartford silenced him. "You'll have your chance to speak, Sheriff. Let the woman finish." When Clara was done, Natane stepped forward. She told her story about Caden's abuse, about the ropes and the stakes, about her son being used as a pawn in a land fraud scheme. She explained how Caden had approached Josiah for help in tracking her down, how Josiah had agreed in exchange for a percentage of the land profits. "How do you know this?" Judge Hartford asked. "Because I heard them discussing it," Natane said, "the night before I ran. They thought I was asleep, but I was awake, and I heard every word." Caden, who had arrived in town that morning, stepped forward from the crowd. "She lies. This is the word of a disobedient wife trying to escape her obligations." "Then perhaps you can explain this," Judge Hartford said. He held up a document. "This is a land claim registration form filed with the Territorial Office 3 weeks ago. It lists you, Caden, as the claimant, and your son Ashkey as the basis for the claim. But according to Apache law, which is recognized by federal treaty, a child belongs to both parents unless there is a formal dissolution of marriage. There has been no such dissolution, which means this claim is fraudulent." Caden's confident expression faltered. "I was told this was legal. I was told by Sheriff Ashford that—" He stopped, realizing too late that he had just implicated Josiah. Judge Hartford turned to Josiah. "Did you advise Mr. Caden on how to file this claim?" Josiah's face was stone. "I may have answered some questions. That doesn't make me part of any fraud." "Perhaps not," Judge Hartford agreed. "But it does establish a connection between you and Mr. Caden, a connection that becomes very interesting when combined with Mrs. Clara Ashford's testimony about your involvement in Lillian Ashford's death." It was then that Bidziel stepped forward. The old Apache elder moved slowly, but when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of authority. "I must speak truth," Bidziel said, "though it shames me to do so." The crowd fell silent. "Caden is my son," Bidziel continued, "and I have protected him for too long, but I can no longer remain silent while he destroys everything our people stand for." Caden's face went white. "Father, no." But Bidziel continued, inexorable as a river. "Natane is not the first wife my son has abused. Before her, there was another, a young woman named Takala. She died 7 years ago. The tribe was told it was an accident, that she fell from a cliff while gathering herbs. But I saw the bruises on her body when they brought her back. I saw the marks on her throat. She did not fall. She was killed, and I believe my son killed her." The crowd erupted in shocked whispers. Caden lunged toward his father, but Dayami and another Apache man grabbed him, holding him back. "You have no proof," Caden shouted. "You are an old man whose mind has gone soft." "I have proof," Bidziel said sadly. He reached into his shirt and pulled out a small leather pouch. From it, he extracted a piece of cloth, faded and stained. "This is a piece of Takala's dress, the piece that was torn when she fought back, and on it is blood. Not just her blood, but the blood of her killer, the blood of the person who held her while she died." He looked at his son with infinite sadness. "I kept this for 7 years, hoping I was wrong, hoping that somehow I had misunderstood what I saw. But when you began to treat Natan the same way, when I saw history repeating itself, I knew I could not stay silent anymore, even if it means destroying my own son." Judge Hartford took the cloth carefully. "This will need to be examined. But if it shows what you claim, Mr. Bidzil, then we're talking about murder in addition to fraud and assault." Josiah, sensing the tide turning decisively against his ally, made his move. He drew his gun, pointing it at Clara. "Nobody moves. This whole thing is a setup. These people are conspiring to destroy me, and I won't let it happen." But he had miscalculated. In his desperation, he had drawn his weapon in front of the territorial governor, a federal judge, and dozens of witnesses. There was no way to spin this as anything other than what it was: a corrupt lawman threatening violence to escape justice. Marshal Finch drew his own weapon. "Put it down, Josiah. It's over." For a moment, Josiah's gun wavered between Clara and Finch. His face was a mask of rage and desperation. Then suddenly, he swung the gun toward Garrett. "This is your fault," Josiah snarled. "You couldn't just let it go. You couldn't just let Lillian's death lie. You had to keep pushing, keep digging. Well, if I'm going down, I'm taking you with me, brother." His finger tightened on the trigger. What happened next occurred so quickly that most witnesses would later disagree on the exact sequence of events. But Garrett saw it all with crystal clarity. Natan moved. Despite being 10 feet away, despite having no weapon, despite the impossibility of reaching Josiah before he fired, she moved. Her powerful legs launched her forward with the speed of a striking snake. Her hand caught Josiah's wrist just as the gun went off, deflecting his aim. The bullet went wild, burying itself in the wooden wall of the courthouse. Josiah tried to swing the gun back toward Natan, but she was already inside his guard, her other hand driving up into his solar plexus with enough force to lift him off his feet. The gun clattered to the ground. Josiah collapsed, gasping for air. And Natan stood over him, breathing hard, her eyes blazing with a fury that had been building for 10 years. "You do not get to hurt anyone else," she said. "Not today, not ever again." Marshal Finch moved in quickly, securing Josiah's hands behind his back. Other men moved to help, townspeople who had watched the whole scene unfold and now saw clearly what Josiah truly was. Judge Hartford picked up Josiah's gun carefully. Assault with a deadly weapon on a federal officer. Attempted murder. Add that to the list of charges, Marshal Finch. The governor stepped forward, his expression grave. "This is a dark day for the territory, but also a day when justice has finally been served. Judge Hartford, I'm formally requesting that you come out of retirement to oversee the prosecution of this case. We need someone above reproach to ensure fairness." Hartford nodded. "I accept." He turned to Bidzil. "And you, sir, your testimony today required great courage, great integrity. The Apache people should be proud to have you among their elders." Bidzil bowed his head. "I am not proud. I am merely doing what should have been done long ago." He looked at Caden, who stood defeated between Diami and the other Apache men. "My son, you will face justice according to our laws and the laws of the white man. I will not protect you anymore. But I will pray that someday you understand why I did this, why I chose justice over family." Caden said nothing. His face was empty, all fight gone from him. It was then that Ashki, who had been standing quietly beside his mother throughout the whole ordeal, finally spoke. "Mother," he said in Apache, which Diami translated for the crowd. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you. I'm sorry I thought you had abandoned me." Natane knelt down, bringing herself to her son's eye level. "You have nothing to be sorry for," she said gently. "You are a child. It was not your responsibility to see through your father's lies. "Will you take me with you?" Ashki asked. "Can I come live with you?" Natan looked up at Bidzil. The old man nodded slowly. "The council has decided," Bidzil said. "Natan is granted full custody of her son. Caden's rights as a father are revoked. The boy will live with his mother, and he will be taught both the ways of the Apache and the ways of the changing world. He will be a bridge between two peoples, as all our children must be if we are to survive." Natan pulled her son into her arms, holding him tightly, and for the first time since Garrett had met her, he saw tears on her face. Not tears of pain or fear, but tears of relief and joy. The crowd began to disperse slowly, people talking in excited voices about what they had witnessed. The governor spoke with Judge Hartford and Marshal Finch, making plans for the trials to come. The Apache riders prepared to return to their lands, their mission accomplished. Clara stood beside Garrett, watching it all unfold. "We did it," she said softly. "We actually did it." "You did it," Garrett corrected. "You were the one who had the courage to speak first, the one who set all of this in motion." Clara shook her head. "No, we all did it. Natan, Bidzil, Dayami, even Judge Hartford and Marshal Finch. It took all of us to stand against them. One person alone would have been crushed, but together we were strong enough." She was right, Garrett knew. This victory had not been achieved by any single hero. It had been a collective effort, people from different cultures and backgrounds coming together because they all understood one simple truth: that justice delayed is justice denied, and that standing up to power requires courage from everyone, not just the few. As the sun climbed toward noon, Garrett found himself standing beside Natan. They watched as Josiah was led away in chains, as Caden was turned over to Apache custody to face trial before his own people. "What will you do now?" Garrett asked. Natan looked down at Ashki, who was talking animatedly with Dayami, the boy's natural energy returning now that fear no longer held him down. "I will go back to your ranch, if the offer still stands," Natane said. "I will raise my son there, at least for a while. Teach him what I know, learn what I need to learn. And when the time is right, when Ashki is old enough to understand, I will tell him everything. About his father, about what happened, about why sometimes we have to fight for freedom even when the cost is high." "The offer stands," Garrett said, "for as long as you need it." "And you?" Natan asked. "What will you do?" Garrett thought of Lillian's wedding dress hanging on his wall, thought of 5 years of guilt and regret, thought of the man he had been and the man he was becoming. "I think," he said slowly, "I'll finally be able to sleep at night." 2 years had passed since that day in Copper Ridge when the truth finally broke free like water through a dam. 2 years since Josiah was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison for attempted murder and conspiracy to commit fraud. 2 years since Caden was exiled from his tribe, stripped of his warrior status, and sent to live alone in the Badlands where no Apache would speak his name. 2 years since Natan had stood in a public square and reclaimed not just her freedom, but her voice. The Arizona sun still burned with the same merciless intensity. The desert still stretched endlessly in all directions. But Garrett Ashford's ranch had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The old wooden house no longer stood alone against the wind. 3 additional structures had been built, simple but solid, forming a loose compound around the original building. A well had been dug, deeper and more reliable than the old one. A garden flourished in soil that had been carefully amended and tended. And most notably, there were people, women and children mostly, though a few men as well, faces that had arrived bearing wounds both visible and invisible, seeking refuge in a place that had become known throughout the territory as the Unbound House. Garrett stood in the morning light, watching as Natan worked with a group of 4 women in the practice yard. She was teaching them to fight, her tall frame moving with controlled grace as she demonstrated a defensive technique. The women mirrored her movements, some more successfully than others, but all with fierce concentration. These were not exercises for sport or recreation. These were skills for survival. One of the women was Clara. She had stayed after Josiah's trial, choosing not to return to the life she had known before. Her father had passed away peacefully 6 months ago, releasing her from the last tie to her former existence. Now, she taught reading and writing to the children who came to the ranch, preparing them for a world that required literacy to navigate. Her bruises had long since faded, but the memory of them remained, driving her to help others who bore similar marks. Another woman was Elara Whitfield, the teacher who had helped translate during the confrontation with the Apache Council. She had come to the ranch initially to help with education, but had stayed because she found here something she had been searching for her whole life: purpose, community, a place where her skills were valued and her past did not define her future. Then there was Rosa Martinez, a Mexican woman who had escaped from men who had tried to sell her across the border. She spoke little of where she had come from, but her hands, scarred and strong, spoke volumes about what she had endured. She tended the garden with a devotion that bordered on religious, coaxing life from soil that seemed determined to remain barren. And there was Sarah Bennett, the newest arrival, barely 18 years old, who had run from a marriage arranged by her father to a man 3 times her age. She still jumped at sudden sounds, still slept with a knife under her pillow, but each day brought small improvements. Yesterday, Garrett had seen her laugh at something one of the children said. It was the first time he had heard her laugh since she arrived. This was what the unbound house had become. Not just a refuge, but a community, a place where people who had been broken by systems that claimed to protect them could rebuild themselves on their own terms. Garrett walked toward the practice yard as the lesson concluded. Natane dismissed the women with words of encouragement, then turned to face him. She was 36 years old now, her face weathered by sun and experience, but there was a peace in her eyes that had not been there 2 years ago. The hunted look was gone, replaced by something harder and more durable: confidence. "They're getting better," Garrett observed. "Yes," Natane agreed. "Clara especially. She has natural talent. Give her another year and she could teach others herself. That's the idea, isn't it? Each one teach one. Build something that can sustain itself." Natane nodded. "It is the Apache way. We survive not as individuals, but as a people. Each person carries knowledge, passes it to the next generation. The chain continues." From across the yard, a boy's voice called out, "Mother, Uncle Diame is here." Ashki came running, no longer the frightened 10-year-old who had clung to his mother's hand 2 years ago. At 12, he was already showing signs of becoming tall like his mother, his body lean and strong from work and training. He spent his days learning both Apache traditions from visiting tribal members and English education from Clara. He could track a deer through rocky terrain and solve arithmetic problems with equal facility. He was, as Bidzil had predicted, becoming a bridge between 2 worlds. Behind him rode Diame, Caden's brother, who had chosen honor over family loyalty. He visited the ranch regularly, maintaining the connection between Natane and her people, ensuring that Ashki did not lose his cultural heritage even while learning to navigate the white world. Diame dismounted and embraced Natane in the Apache way, then clasped hands with Garrett. "I bring news," he said. "Some good, some less so." They moved into the shade of the main house, where Clara brought water and bread. Diame drank deeply before speaking. "The good news first. The territorial legislature has passed a law allowing women to testify in court on equal standing with men. Judge Hartford pushed for it, using your case as an example of why such a law was necessary. It is a small step, but an important one." Clara's hand went to her throat. "That means other women won't have to fight as hard as we did to be heard?" "That is the hope," Diame said. "The law does not guarantee justice, but it removes one barrier to seeking it." "And the less good news?" Garrett asked. Diame's expression darkened. "Caden is dead. He was found 3 weeks ago in the Badlands. The circumstances are unclear. Some say he died of thirst, that he simply gave up and walked into the desert without water. Others say it was suicide. A few whisper that he was killed by someone seeking revenge for old wrongs. Natan was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady but soft. "How do you feel about this, Dayami? He was your brother." "I grieve for the man he could have been," Dayami said. "But I cannot grieve for the man he chose to become. He was given many chances to change, to seek redemption. He refused them all. In the end, he was destroyed by his own pride and anger." Ashki, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "Should I feel sad? He was my father." Natane knelt beside her son, taking his hands in hers. "You feel whatever you feel, my son. There is no should in grief. Your father did terrible things, but he was still your father. It is possible to acknowledge both truths at once." "I mostly feel nothing," Ashki admitted. "Is that wrong?" "No," Natane said gently. "It is honest, and honesty is never wrong." The conversation moved to other matters, tribal news and territorial politics, the small details that connected their isolated ranch to the wider world. But Garrett noticed that Natan remained quiet, her mind clearly elsewhere. Later, after Diemi had left and the evening meal was being prepared, Garrett found Natan sitting alone on the ridge behind the house, looking out over the desert as the sun began its descent. "You're thinking about him," Garrett said, sitting down beside her. "Yes," Natan admitted. "Not with sadness exactly, more with a kind of wondering. I keep thinking about the man I married at 16. He was not cruel then. He was strong and proud, yes, but not cruel. I wonder when that changed. I wonder if there was a moment when he chose to become what he became, or if it happened so gradually that he never even noticed." "Does it matter?" Garrett asked. "I think it does," Natan said. "Because if I understand how one person becomes a monster, maybe I can help prevent it from happening to others. Maybe I can see the signs earlier. Maybe I can save someone before they go too far down that path." She turned to look at Garrett. "Is that foolish? To think we can change people?" "I don't know," Garrett said honestly. "But I know we can create spaces where people can change themselves, where they have the support and safety to become better than they were. That's what this place is, isn't it? Not a place where we fix broken people, but a place where people can fix themselves." Natan smiled slightly. "You have become wise, Garrett Ashford. I've had good teachers," he replied. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun painted the desert in shades of orange and gold. Down below, smoke rose from the cooking fire. Children's laughter echoed across the yard. Clara's voice carried clearly as she read a story to the younger ones. It was, Garrett thought, the sound of hope. Fragile, perhaps, but real. "I have been thinking," Natan said after a while, "about expanding. There are more women who need help than we can accommodate here. I have heard of other ranches, other communities that might be willing to create similar refuges. If we could connect them, create a network, we could help more people." "That's ambitious," Garrett said. "Yes, but necessary. The world is changing, Garrett. Women are beginning to demand rights that were always denied to them. But with that demand comes backlash. Men who are threatened by change, who will fight to maintain their power. We need to be ready to help the women who will be caught in that fight." "What do you need from me?" "Your support. Your name. You are a white man with property and standing. When you speak, certain people listen who would never listen to an Apache woman. I hate that this is true, but denying reality does not change it." "You have my support," Garrett said. "Always. Even if it means using your ranch, your resources, in ways you never intended." "This ranch stopped being just mine the day you arrived," Garrett said. "It belongs to everyone who needs it. That was always the point." Natan reached out and squeezed his hand briefly. It was a rare gesture of affection from a woman who had learned to be wary of touch. "Thank you, my friend." They stood and walked back down the ridge together as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Below, the lights of the unbound house glowed warm and welcoming. In-mead women who had been strangers were becoming sisters. Children who had known only fear were learning to play again. And slowly, imperceptibly, a new way of living was being born. It was not perfect. There were still hard days, still moments when old traumas surfaced and had to be confronted. There were still arguments and tensions, still the grinding difficulty of building something new from the wreckage of the old. But there was also joy. There was also growth. There was also the undeniable evidence that change, real change, was possible. That night, as the household settled into sleep, Garrett stood for a moment in the main room of his house. Lillian's wedding dress still hung on the wall, but it was no longer the only thing there. Beside it now hung a piece of Apache beadwork that Natane had made, a gift to honor Lillian's memory. On the opposite wall was a drawing that Ashki had done, showing all the residents of the ranch standing together. And on the mantel was a photograph, taken by a traveling photographer 6 months ago, showing Garrett, Natane, Clara, and all the others gathered in front of the house, their faces serious but hopeful. This, Garrett thought, was what redemption looked like. Not a single moment of heroism, but years of daily choices to do better, be better, help others be better. It was unglamorous and difficult, and sometimes felt like pushing a boulder uphill, but it was real, and it mattered. He blew out the lamp and went to his small room, the one he had moved to when Natane and Ashki took the larger bedroom. As he lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the house settling around him, he found himself thinking about the question Natane had asked earlier. Could people change? He thought about Josiah, who had chosen pride and power over integrity and was now spending his days in a prison cell. He thought about Caden, who had let bitterness poison him until there was nothing left but anger and pain. He thought about Clara, who had found the courage to speak truth after years of silence. He thought about Natane, who had reclaimed her strength and was now using it to lift others. Yes, he decided, people could change, but only if they wanted to. Only if they were willing to do the hard work of facing themselves honestly and choosing, day after day, to be better than they had been. Change was not a gift bestowed by others. It was a battle fought within oneself, a battle that never truly ended but could be won one day at a time. And as he drifted toward sleep, Garrett Ashford, who had once been a man paralyzed by guilt and regret, felt something he had not felt in years. He felt proud. Not proud of what he had done, but proud of what they had all done together. Proud of the small corner of the world they had managed to make a little bit better, a little bit safer, a little bit more just. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be more women seeking refuge, more children needing guidance, more battles to fight against systems that resisted change. But tonight, for this moment, there was peace, and that was enough. 5 years after that first day when Garrett found Natane bound to stakes in the desert, the landscape of the Arizona Territory had shifted in ways both large and small. The Unbound house had inspired 3 similar refuges in neighboring counties, each run independently but connected through a network of support and shared resources. Judge Hartford, before his second retirement, had helped establish legal protections that made it harder for abusive spouses to use the courts as weapons. And slowly, painfully, the culture itself was beginning to shift. Not everywhere, not for everyone, but enough that women who once would have suffered in silence now knew there were places they could go, people who would help them, voices that would speak on their behalf. Ashki was 15 now, tall and strong like his mother, but with a quietness of spirit that was all his own. He had chosen to spend this year learning advanced Apache traditions from the tribal elders, living part-time in the winter camp while maintaining his connection to the ranch. It was a balance that reflected his dual heritage, and he navigated it with a grace that made both Natane and Garrett proud. On this particular morning, a bright October day when the desert heat had finally begun to ease toward the cooler months, a rider approached the ranch. But this was no desperate refugee seeking shelter. This was a young man in his early 20s, well-dressed and confident, riding a good horse and carrying himself with the ease of someone who had never known true hardship. Garrett met him at the gate. "Can I help you?" The young man dismounted and extended his hand. "My name is Thomas Whitmore. I'm a journalist from San Francisco. I've been hearing stories about this place, about what you've built here. I'd like to write about it if you'll allow me." Garrett's first instinct was to refuse. They had deliberately kept a low profile, avoiding publicity that might attract the wrong kind of attention. But something in the young man's earnest expression made him pause. "Why?" Garrett asked. "Because the world needs to know that change is possible," Thomas said. "Because there are people in cities back east who think the frontier is just cowboys and outlaws and violence. They don't know about places like this, about people like you, and I think they should." "It's not just me," Garrett said. "It's never been just me." "Then let me tell their stories too," Thomas said. "The women who built this place, the children who are growing up here, the whole community. Let me show people what's possible when we choose to be better than our worst impulses." Garrett looked back toward the house where Natane was emerging from the barn, curious about the visitor. He made a decision. "You can stay for a week," he said. "Talk to whoever is willing to talk to you, but we have rules. No real names for anyone who doesn't want to be identified, no location specific enough that someone could find us who shouldn't, and no romanticizing. Tell the truth, the whole truth, including the hard parts, or don't tell it at all." Thomas agreed eagerly, and for the next week he became part of the daily life of the ranch, observing, asking questions, filling notebook after notebook with careful handwriting. He talked to Clara about her work teaching children. He talked to Rosa about the garden and what it meant to coax life from hostile soil. He talked to Sarah, now 20, and confident in ways her 18-year-old self could never have imagined, about what it felt like to reclaim control of your own future. And he talked to Natane. Long conversations that stretched into the evening about Apache traditions and women's rights and the intersection of cultures and the slow work of healing. She showed him the training yard, explained the philosophy behind teaching women to defend themselves, not just physically, but emotionally and legally as well. "Strength is not just about muscles," Natane explained as Thomas took notes. "It is about knowing your worth, knowing your rights, knowing when to fight and when to walk away and when to ask for help. We teach all of these things here." "And it works?" Thomas asked. "Look around you," Natane said. "Does it look like it works?" Thomas did look around. He saw women working together, supporting each other, building something real and lasting. He saw children playing without fear. He saw a community that had created itself out of necessity and sustained itself through mutual commitment. "Yes," he said quietly, "it does." On Thomas's last evening at the ranch, the community gathered for a communal meal, something they did once a week. It was a chance to share news, settle disputes, celebrate victories, and simply be together. As they ate, Thomas asked Garrett the question he had been building toward all week. "What made you do this? What made you decide to turn your ranch into a refuge?" Garrett looked across the table at Natane, then at Clara, then at all the faces gathered in the warm lamplight. "I didn't decide," he said. "It just happened. One person needed help, so I helped. Then another person needed help, and another. And at some point, I realized this was what the place was meant to be. Not a cattle ranch, not a farm, but a place where people could be safe while they figured out who they were meant to become." "And you?" Thomas turned to Natane. "What drives you to do this work?" Natane was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "I remember what it felt like to be bound," she said finally, "to be held down, powerless, while someone else decided my fate. I remember the fear, the helplessness, the certainty that I would die there in the dirt and no one would care." She looked at Ashki, who was listening intently. "But I also remember what it felt like when Garrett gave me a knife and walked away, when he gave me the chance to free myself instead of doing it for me. That was the moment I understood something important. Freedom is not something someone gives you, it is something you take, but sometimes you need someone to hand you the knife." "That's what we do here," Clara added. "We hand people the knife. We teach them how to use it, and then we stand back and let them cut their own ropes." Thomas wrote furiously, capturing every word. When he left the next morning, he promised to send them a copy of the article when it was published. Garrett did not think much of it. Journalists made many promises that were never kept. But 3 months later, a package arrived. Inside was a copy of Harper's Weekly magazine, one of the most widely read publications in the country. The cover story was titled "The Unbound: How One Ranch in Arizona Became a Beacon of Hope for Women Fleeing Violence." The article was everything Thomas had promised it would be: honest, detailed, unflinching in its description of what the women had endured, but also hopeful in its portrayal of what they had built. It named no names, gave no specific locations, but painted a vivid picture of the unbound house and what it represented. Within weeks, letters began arriving, some from women asking for help, some from people offering donations, some from other communities asking for advice on how to start similar refuges. The response was overwhelming, and with it came new challenges. More people meant more resources needed. More publicity meant more scrutiny, both positive and negative. There were letters of support, but also letters of condemnation from those who believed that helping women leave their marriages was destroying the fabric of society. Through it all, the work continued. The garden was expanded. A 4th building was constructed. A visiting doctor began making monthly rounds to provide medical care. A lawyer from Tucson volunteered to help with legal matters. The network grew organically, each person contributing what they could, taking only what they needed. On a spring morning 6 years after that first fateful meeting, Natane and Garrett stood together on the ridge overlooking the ranch. The compound had grown to include 7 buildings now, housing nearly 30 people at any given time. It was no longer a ranch in any traditional sense. It was something new, something that did not have a proper name in English or Apache. It was simply the Unbound House, and that was enough. "Do you ever regret it?" Natane asked. "Giving up your quiet life for all of this?" Garrett thought about the question. He thought about the man he had been 6 years ago, alone with his guilt, maintaining a ranch that had no real purpose beyond keeping him busy. He thought about Lillian and the ways he had failed her. He thought about all the women and children who had passed through this place, each carrying their own burdens, each finding here some measure of peace. "No," he said, "I don't regret it. This is what I was supposed to do all along. I just didn't know it until you showed me." Natane smiled. "We showed each other. That is how it works. We save each other by allowing ourselves to be saved." Below them, Ashki was teaching a group of younger children how to track animals in the desert, pointing out signs that most people would miss. His voice carried up the ridge, patient and clear. Clara was holding class under the shade of a newly planted cottonwood tree. A dozen children bent over slates and books. Rosa was in the garden showing a new arrival how to identify which plants were edible and which were poisonous. It was life. Ordinary, extraordinary life. And it was beautiful. "There is something I want to show you," Natane said. She led Garrett back down to the main house and into her room. From a drawer, she pulled out a piece of cloth, old and faded. It was the rope that had bound her ankles that first day. "I kept it," she said, "as a reminder." "A reminder of what?" Garrett asked. "Of where I started. Of how far I have come. Of the fact that the things that once held me down are now just old rope. No power, no threat, just fiber and memory." She handed it to Garrett. "I want you to have it. Or rather, I want you to do something with it." "What?" "Burn it," Natane said. "I think it is time to let it go, to stop carrying even the memory of being bound. I am ready to move forward without looking back." That evening, as the sun set and the community gathered for their weekly meal, Garrett and Natane built a small fire away from the main gathering. They stood together, the old rope between them, and Natane spoke in Apache. Garrett did not understand all the words, but he understood the meaning. It was a prayer of release, an acknowledgement of pain survived, a commitment to the future. She placed the rope in the fire. It caught quickly, the dry fibers burning bright and hot. They stood and watched until there was nothing left but ash. "It's done," Natane said softly. "No," Garrett said. "It's just beginning." He was right. The burning of the rope was not an ending, but a transition. A sign that Natane had moved from survivor to thriver, from someone defined by what had been done to her to someone defined by what she chose to do. In the years that followed, the unbound house continued to grow and evolve. Ashki, at 19, chose to study law, determined to change the systems that made places like the unbound house necessary. Clara wrote a book about her experiences, published under a pseudonym, that became required reading for social reformers. Rosa's garden became so productive that they were able to sell surplus vegetables in town, creating financial sustainability. And Natana became something she had never imagined she could be: a leader, a teacher, a symbol. Women throughout the territory knew her name, knew her story, drew strength from her example. She traveled to other communities, helping them establish their own refuges, sharing what she had learned, building a movement that would outlast any individual. But through it all, she remained grounded in the simple work of daily life at the ranch. Teaching women to fight, tending the injured, listening to stories of pain and offering no easy answers, just presence and support. She understood that revolutions were not built in grand gestures, but in small acts of courage repeated day after day until the world had no choice but to change. On a summer evening 10 years after that first day in the desert, Garrett and Natane sat on the porch of the main house, watching the sun set. They were older now, marked by time and work, but strong in the ways that mattered. "Do you think we've made a difference?" Garrett asked. Natane gestured to the compound where lights were beginning to glow in windows, where voices called out in English and Spanish and Apache, where children laughed and women talked and life continued in all its messy, beautiful complexity. "Look around you," she said. "What do you think?" Garrett looked. He saw a woman who had arrived last month with 2 black eyes and a broken arm, now standing straight and tall, teaching her daughter to read. He saw a boy who had watched his father beat his mother, now learning from Ashki that there was another way to be a man. He saw Clara and Rosa working together in the garden, 2 women who had nothing in common except survival, now as close as sisters. "Yes," he said, "I think we've made a difference." "Then that is enough," Natane said. "We cannot change the whole world, but we can change our corner of it, and maybe, if enough people change their corners, eventually the whole world shifts." As darkness fell, the stars emerged one by one, ancient and constant. The desert wind blew soft and warm. And in the unbound house, people who had once been broken slept safely, dreaming not of the past, but of the future. They were building together, one day, one choice, one act of courage at a time. The rope that had once bound Natane was gone, burned to ash and scattered on the wind. But the bonds that held the community together were stronger than ever. Not bonds of force or obligation, but bonds freely chosen, freely maintained, bonds of respect and trust and shared purpose. These were the ropes that truly mattered, the ones that connected rather than constrained, the ones that lifted rather than pulled down, the ones that said, "I see you, I value you, I stand with you." And as Garrett Ashford closed his eyes that night, he thought of Lillian one last time. Not with guilt or regret, but with gratitude. Her death had been a tragedy. But from that tragedy had grown something beautiful and lasting. A place where her memory lived not in sorrow, but in the countless lives that had been saved, the countless futures that had been reclaimed. "Thank you," he whispered into the darkness, "for showing me what I needed to become." And somewhere in the vast Arizona night, the wind carried his words away, up into the stars, where they joined the prayers and hopes and dreams of all those who had ever fought for freedom, who had ever chosen courage over comfort, who had ever believed that one person or a small group of people could make the world a little bit better. They were right. The end.